Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to show the game Kramnik from the Dortmund 06 tournament. To my mind, it was a very beautiful game, and it was fitting that it was also the decisive game in the final round. I think Kramnik gets a lot of flack because he doesn't play really aggressive chess in the way that Kasparov did. His chess is beautiful in a different way, more in the style of Smyslov and Karpov. And I think it's hard for chess fans to appreciate his play. When we look at a game like this, we're not going to see flashy sacrifices. We're going to see a very deep understanding of geometry, of kind of a symphony of the forces, and very subtle points that aren't really able to be even appreciated on the first or second playthrough. At least they weren't for me. I had to really dig to understand what was going on. In particular, what's nice about this game is one really has to look at the game over and over again to even begin to understand where Liko might have even gone wrong. And that's really the hallmark of a fantastic game, is when a player plays so perfectly as white that we have to really look to see where black could find some improvements. Okay, let's begin. I'm not going to spend too much time on the opening, but I'm going to say a couple words. One thing about Kramnik's play that's nice is that he first in the 90s was playing knight f3 exclusively. Then he had this phase where he switched to e4, which wasn't so successful. And now what he's doing is he's really looking at what his opponent is playing, examining their repertoire, and then playing either knight f3, e4, or even d4, as we see in this game, depending on what he sees. And that makes him a much more dangerous opponent, because it's much more difficult to prepare for him. Okay, now one thing I want to show is back in the day he played many games in this variation that looks like a Nimzo Indian, with queen c2 Nimzo Indian. Except, of course, instead of the pawn being on d4, it's on d2, and the knight's on f3. Now, to my mind, this is a slightly better version, or it always seemed a better version for white, because we haven't committed the d pawn yet. And in particular, this diagonal isn't even open. But we'll see in this game that it's kind of interesting that the variation that Kramnik employs when the queen c2 Nimzo Indian, he's able to use this f2 pawn to move him up to f3 to control some central squares in kind of an interesting, somewhat amazing way. So let's look at the game. So here we have d4 and your standard queen c2 Nimzo, which is probably, from an objective standpoint, the most serious try to get an advantage against the Nimzo. And Liko plays the most, I think, the most solid line here. Okay. f3. Now, I want to say a couple things about this position. Let's actually back up before we play f3. Kind of the hallmark of this queen c2 variation is that white gains the two bishops, and in particular he has an unopposed dark square bishop, this bishop on g5, which is very hard to deal with, and that's also the case in this game. So he has some long-term strategic factors, but what he doesn't have is he's down in development. He's basically invested time to gain that dark square bishop with queen c2 and then a3, moves that weren't developing moves. And that's why this move f3, which has been played many times before, but is nevertheless still very interesting, because you're investing a whole move not developing your pieces when you're already down in development. So it's kind of a gamble in a way, because what f3 is also looking for is some long-term strategical ideas. One is to cut down the scope of this bishop, and we're definitely going to see that in this game. The second is simply that this knight now is lacking in squares. And of course we're threatening maybe to play e4 ourselves. So f3 is again going for long-term strategical objectives, but it's at the risk of just getting blown out of the water by black's quick development. And now d5. it's amazing. Black is incredibly well developed. And he's threatening now to open the center with c5, so white resolves the tension. Now, black can play e takes d5 here as well, but Liko plays this line, knight takes d5. And here, again, this characteristic of the position that white has long-term strategical goals and black has development is definitely still applies to this position. Now, Liko plays here c5. Another move is also f5, but I think c5 can't be bad. e4, knight e7. Now, one thing we have to already notice about this position is that even though white's incredibly down in development, he has this unopposed bishop, the two bishops, and maybe more importantly at this point is that this pawn chain here is dominating the black bishop and is also dominating this knight on e7. So black is going to, even though he's up technically in development, those pieces aren't at the moment doing anything. White develops. c8, knight c3. Threatening knight b3. And Kramnik just steps aside with bishop e3. Rook takes, king takes. Okay, so I went through the opening kind of quickly, and that was because I wanted to spend more time on this position and the positions that ensue, because this is really where Kramnik demonstrated his class. Now, Zoltán Lámasi, who is also from Hungary as Liko is, has had this position twice. And both times he played e5 as Liko did in this game. I think, however, e5 is a mistake. Let's look at what's going on here for a little bit. Now, clearly, I have to take care of my bishop and my rook, and black would like to do something with this knight and this bishop. And when we look closer, we see that black also has the problem of the king. White's king now, because it didn't develop, in a sense, right, it stayed in the middle. Now that the queens are off, it's now to white's advantage that his king's there. And one of the things the king does that's very nice is that whilst he's getting out his forces, the bishop and the rook, that king will help consolidate the squares that black might penetrate into. That is, he can control a lot of these squares on the queen side, like by coming to a square like c2, as we'll see in the game. So really, black has three problem pieces at this point, even though he's up in development. And what I don't like about e5 is that e5 really doesn't address a lot of those problems. And for that reason, I think f5 would have been a stronger move. What f5 does is does three things, really. By tickling this pawn, if white takes, which it's kind of hard to see what else he's going to do here, it's going to open the scope of the bishop, it's going to give the knight more squares to go to, and it's going to give the king a square to go to. So what f5 is a nice move because it would enable all three of black's poorly placed pieces. And for example, a variation might go something like e takes, knight takes, bishop f2, king f7, where really black is considerably more active than he was in the game. Now notice, you could object and say, well, this pawn on e6 is weak. Well, yes, that's true, but a bigger danger is that white makes some of our pieces suffocate, and that's really what happens in the game. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, this e5 move looks very it looks like the most natural move in the world, and it can't be wrong, but I think it's the beginning of Liko's problems here. So he plays e5, and now in this position, the games that had been played before, white played a kind of a weak move here and played king c2, which just allowed black to play knight a4, pressuring this knight. This beautiful bishop has to come back to d2, and then black breaks And now black really can't complain. He's doing fine. So, but Kramnik just played a move that makes much more sense than king c2. First he kicks away the knight, comes back to e6, and now just king c2. Very nice move. And like I said, the king will be able to control the squares in which black will try to penetrate. Knight c6, king b2, another very nice move. Just putting the king in a nice spot where he's out of the line of fire of the rook, and the knight coming into d4. Okay, so here I feel safe to say that Lico's in a little bit of trouble. It's not only the two bishops that are the problem, it's that our pieces are better. In particular, this bishop on b7 isn't doing so hot. And the knights can come to d4, but it's not clear what they're actually going to do from d4. Now, my sense in this position was that Kramnik thought, who's a very good defender, thought that one of his biggest concerns was that white had the two bishops. And I think what he missed when he made the following move was Kramnik's plan of trading off one of the bishops. Now, let's talk a little bit about this. So, when we look at white's position, all of his pieces are doing fine. Obviously, we have to get our bishop on f1 out and the rook out. But when we look at this bishop, where do we put him? It's not so clear. On e2, he's going to get hit by one of the knights. On c4, he's going to get hit by the rook. And on b5, he's also going to get hit by the knight on d4. And on d3, he's just a little bit unlucky. The rook, it's not clear what he's going to be doing there on d3. So, Lico played king f8, and this is maybe the second in accuracy. It's again the most natural move in the world, and it's hard to believe that it could be bad. And the problem is that now Kramnik plays bishop c4, and this is very nice. Now Kramnik, is famous for using the two bishops, but now he's going to willingly trade the thing off for one of black's knights, and the game progressed like this. And we'll come back to this position, but I want to go back just a couple moves. So really, in this position, black probably had to play knight to d4 instead of king f8, preventing bishop to c4. But still, after bishop d3, white has clearly some kind of edge. Maybe nothing fantastic, but he has definitely an edge. And what I think this is a good example of is there's a Russian proverb which says the advantage of the two bishops is that you can trade one of them off. And that's obviously meant in an ironic way, but when we think about this situation now with Lico I don't think appreciated this combination, because he felt, well, if he's going to trade off one of his bishops, it can't be all that dangerous. And that's precisely one of the hidden points in the proverb, is that you can trade off your advantage of the two bishops and transform it into another advantage. And because your opponent will be so happy to get rid of one of the bishops, it's often the type of plan, like this bishop c4 move, that your opponent will not be able to foresee. So bishop c4, bishop takes, knight takes, and now we're doing much better. Knight b5. Notice in particular how this bishop, which is massaging this pawn chain here, in its initiative is much stronger than this bishop, which is really hitting on granite over here. And furthermore, now we have a bishop of opposite color situation, and whenever we have that situation, then the person with the initiative will have even more of an advantage. And we've talked about that on different lectures, why that's the case. Okay, so black has to play the rook over here and be passive. But it still looks like he's going to be fine. He's going to be able to play a move like bishop a6 or bishop c6 to get the knight out. The king's going to come to the center. It doesn't look all that bad yet. And here's, I think, the second point in the game where Kramnik really demonstrated his world-class ability as a chess player. To find plans that aren't obvious here. If you'd like, take some time and try to find a good plan here for white. Stop the VCR. It's really not obvious what he did, but he's really thinking about the big picture, and I think that's really where he's proving himself. Now, we'll notice that the rook would like to come in. He would like to come in maybe to this square, but it's clearly not so easy. Black's just not going to let him do it. So, obviously, most people would want to do something with the rook. And that's the genius of Kramnik's plan, is that he's going to wait to see what to do with the rook and continue with this idea of massaging the pawn chain on b6 and a7. Very nice. Now, Liko has to get rid of the knight on b5. He has to get rid of the knight so that his rook can move. And he played bishop a6. But let's take a look at a sample variation. What would happen if he played bishop c6? Actually, let me just show you the point here. Now, on bishop a6, Kramnik played this beautiful move, knight a3. So the reason I would like to look at bishop c6 is bishop c6 would prevent that because the bishop would hit the pawn on a4. And here it's kind of funny because now we know where the rook goes. The rook goes to a1. So the bishop can't take the knight immediately because this threat is too powerful. So let's say he plays king e7. That's a very natural move. And now maybe knight c3. Rook d8 seems natural. b5. And this is the same thing that happens in the game. White fixes the black pawns, and obviously by advancing his own pawns he's closer to promoting. Bishop b7. Notice that if, say, rook d3, we can play pawn takes bishop because rook takes bishop falls to knight d5. And also now bishop b7, now a5. Massaging the pawns in a different way than happens in the game, but still following the general theme. And so here, for example, also rook d3 would fall to pawn takes, rook takes pawn, knight c5, knight d3, winning. Okay, so what's interesting, see, is that, I looked at the first time I looked at this situation, I thought maybe black would be able to save himself with moves like bishop c6. But in all these cases, black's always landing up in a very difficult situation. Bishop a6, and now this move, knight a3. Very nice move. So the idea is that Kramnik wants to move his knight to this square, and from there he'll massage the pawn chain again, helping the bishop, and he'll attack this pawn. And we'll see in the game it's even important that he controls a5. So rook c8, the most natural move in the world. b5, bishop b7. Notice how bad the bishop is. Now rook c1. Very nice. So Kramnik waited to see where the rook was going to belong. Now the rook belongs in c1 because we want to put our knight on c4. Rook c1, king takes, king e7. Very natural. I mean, all these moves that Liko is making, there's no obvious mistake in here. a5, bishop takes. And now the plan is very simple. To play knight c4, knight a5, b6, b7. And black will be forced to sacrifice his bishop, else we will get a queen. Now, nevertheless, even though the plan's relatively simple, we're in a very delicate phase of the game, because when we look now at the position, now Liko's king isn't all that bad, because if he's going to imagine a scenario where this pawn on b5 advances forward and we sacrifice the bishop for it, if black can get some activity going on the king side while we're doing that, all he has to do is eliminate all of our pawns, and he'll win, and he'll be able to draw the game. So this is a very delicate position for white still. Now, Liko plays f5, And the point is, after pawn takes, this pawn is going to be easily capturable by black, or at least it will be capturable. And now knight f4, and we're really gaining some strong momentum against white's kingside pawns. g3 was played, knight h3, now knight c4. Now, the problem with bishop f3 is now we can unfortunately play even knight e5, though knight a5 I think I calculated as a win too. But knight g5 makes more sense anyway. We would like to take the pawn with a knight and then further harass the white structure. So knight a5. But what's unfortunate about this is now Lico's forced to burn a tempo this way, because if he took on f3 with the bishop, then his own knight can't come to f3. b6. Knight takes f3. h3, good move. Knight g5. b7, takes, knight takes h3. Okay, so this was the position where I think Lico had foreseen, and he probably didn't say to himself that he was drawing this position, but I think he thought that he might have had good chances. And it's in fact very difficult for white to win this position, simply because black's king is very active and would like to come up and eat this pawn, and then come and eat this pawn, and it's very difficult for white to stop this. And of course, he can use his pawns to trade off as well. All he needs to do is trade everything off. And all of white's pieces, the king on c1, the knight on b7, the bishop a7, aren't really yet mobilized to deal with all of this. And that's what makes Kramnik's next move very nice. In hindsight, it's easy, I think, to see this, to think you would find this in a game. And maybe you would, but to foresee it is a whole other thing. Kramnik played bishop b6. This is a very nice move. And the point is, that white needs to control these squares in front of the pawn, in essence controlling the blockading square of this pawn. And so the idea is this bishop's going to come into d8, and this is what's usually called the backwards move, right? He's sticking the bishop in and it's coming back the other way, and those are the hardest moves to foresee. And in an entirely different position, in a middle game position that we looked at here at Chess Lecture, I showed a game where he played at the Olympiad against Brusson, and there was also a key variation where the bishop landed at the very back and then made a backwards movement. So it's kind of fun to see this in two different situations. Now, Lico played king d7, but clearly the big question is what happens if he plays king f6. And the point is knight d6. And now, if you do some kind of nothing move, like moving the knight somewhere, you're actually going to get mated. And that's a very beautiful geometrical shot here. Similar, actually, to a lot of the positions in the bishop and knight checkmate. And if you play g6 to get rid of the pawn, then we play bishop d8. And again, there's trouble because of king. And now this pawn can't be stopped from queening. Okay, so the next question would be, okay, well, let's say the king runs. And this was what I thought was the critical variation. I think we have king d2 seems reasonable, king e4, king e3, and now king takes pawn, and now knight e8 though. This is the unfortunate problem for black. White will be able to take this pawn and at the same time control this guy, and all he needs to do is hold on to one pawn for winning position. Black's still kicking a little bit here, but the position's definitely lost. So let's back up. Seeing that is probably what led Lico to play king d7. But king d7 is in some ways a resigning move, because now we have we have time to mobilize the forces. Bishop e3. Notice that the bishop dominates the knight's movement. king comes back, knight c5, and it's unfortunately over here. Now, if, for example, king f6, we'll just play g4, followed by knight e4, and it's all over. So, Kramnik, or Liko plays one last try. g6, we just take this pawn, and now come back. And now it's a simple win, and Liko resigns. The point will be that any time black approaches this pawn, we can put our knight onto e4 and support it with the king. And the knight on h3, whenever it moves out, we'll just simply take it. So, say a couple things in summary about this game. First, this was a beautiful achievement for Kramnik, and something that chess fans should appreciate is this tournament in Dortmund wasn't that long this year. It was only 7 rounds, and Kramnik had white only in 3 games, which makes it, at this level, I think, much more difficult to win the tournament. So from that perspective alone, that was a fantastic achievement. The other thing I want to say is that even though Kramnik, to my mind, is clearly the world champion, he won the match from Kasparov, and Topalov really hasn't won any match at all. A lot of chess fans would like to say that Topalov is somehow world champion, even though he never played a match for it. And every time I see one of these Kramnik games, it really makes me excited as a chess fan to see what's going to happen with this match coming up between Topalov and Kramnik. Hopefully, we'll be able to reunite the chess world into a system where, again, matches are played for the world championship. Of course, it's totally unclear if that's actually going to happen. I'm actually going to be mildly surprised if this match takes place at all. But nevertheless, I think it's going to be a great match, and people who don't understand this type of play and think Kramnik's just some kind of magician, those chess fans don't understand how dangerous a player he is, and especially for someone like Topalov, I think it would be a very difficult opponent to face, just as Kramnik was a difficult opponent for Kasparov. He was the only person to beat Kasparov ever in a match. So, I'll conclude with that, and I hope you enjoyed this beautiful display by Kramnik in the recent Dortmund tournament. Bye-bye.